I'm the Night Rider, baby! He knows who I am! I am the Night Rider!
Welcome to Movies and Junk, and today we'll be heading to the wasteland. And that's right, we're talking about the original cult classic Mad Max. If there's one movie that defines guerrilla filmmaking, it's definitely George Miller's 1979 debut. It's the film that put Australian cinema on the map, launched Mel Gibson's career, and essentially invented the post-apocalyptic genre as we know it today. But what's even crazier than the stunts you see on screen is the absolute chaos that happened behind the camera to make them possible. We are talking about a movie made with no permits, real outlaw biker gangs, and a director who was literally saving lives in the ER between takes. So, rev your engines and grab a can of Dinky D dog food. Here are 20 facts you didn't know about Mad Max. One of the most insane things about Mad Max is just how low budget it really was. The entire film was shot for around 400,000 Australian dollars. To put that in perspective, the catering budget for Fury Road was probably higher than that. But despite the shoestring budget, the movie went on to gross over $100 million worldwide. For decades, it held the Guinness World Record for the most profitable film ever made based on cost-to-revenue ratio, only to be beaten years later by the Blair Witch Project. Part of the reason the film feels so visceral and violent is because of George Miller's day job. Before he was a legendary director, George Miller was a full-time emergency room doctor in Sydney. He spent his days treating horrific car crash victims, and he used that trauma to fuel the violence in the movie. He famously said that the US has a gun culture, but Australia has a car culture, and he wanted to show the brutal reality of what happens when that culture goes wrong. In fact, he was still working as a doctor during post-production to earn money to keep the movie going. He would literally edit the car chases, then go work a night shift in the ER. Now let's talk about the man himself, Mel Gibson. There is a legendary story about how Mel Gibson got the role of Max Rokitansky. The story goes that he didn't even go to the audition to read for the part. He was actually just giving his friend and roommate, Steve Bisley, who played Goose, a ride to the casting call. Allegedly, Mel had gotten into a massive bar fight the night before, and his face was black and blue. The casting director saw him and said, "Man, we need freaks like you. Come back when you heal up." When he returned 2 weeks later, cleaned up and handsome, they were shocked to realize he was the same guy.
I actually dropped a friend off because he'd been called in for an audition. So I drove him, dropped him, and then I waited for him in the waiting room with the girls at the casting agency. But I'd had a very bad weekend. I got into a brawl, and I didn't come out looking too pretty. I sort of took on half a rugby team, and it didn't work out too well on my end. So I was looking pretty bad. They took Polaroids because I was like really every color of the rainbow, and they put them up. And they said, "Man, we need freaks in this film." He says, when you heal up, come back and see us.
However, I have to be the bearer of bad news. While Mel has told this story for years, Steve Bisley and others have hinted that it's mostly a myth to make him sound tougher. They were actually just drama school kids who auditioned like normal actors. But hey, print the legend, right? Speaking of Steve Bisley, the chemistry between Max and Goose feels so real because it was. Mel Gibson and Steve Bisley were classmates at the National Institute of Dramatic Art and were actual roommates at the time of filming. They were struggling actors living in a cheap flat with no furniture, just like the rest of us. One of the reasons the biker gang, the Acolytes, looked so terrifying is because they weren't really acting. They were a real outlaw motorcycle club called the Vigilantes. George Miller hired them as extras and stunt performers because they already had the bikes, the leather, and the attitude. They rode their own motorcycles in the film and performed many of the dangerous stunts themselves. There is a long-standing rumor that because the production was so broke, the biker gang was paid in beer. While that sounds hilarious, it's only half true. They were paid a small daily rate, but since the production couldn't afford expensive catering, they often provided cases of beer at the end of the day to keep the gang happy. Probably not the best idea when you're asking people to perform high-speed motorcycle stunts the next morning. and the stunts in this movie were legitimately dangerous. In the opening chase scene, when the Knight Rider's car crashes and explodes, that wasn't a miniature or CGI. They literally strapped a military-grade rocket booster to the back of the car and fired it into the earth. The car disintegrated so fast that the camera crew almost missed the shot because they didn't expect it to move that quickly. Then there is the famous bridge stunt. You know, the one where Max does a U-turn and rams his car into the bikers as they fly off the bridge. For years, people thought the stuntman actually died or was critically injured because the body flailing looked so unnatural. The truth is, the stuntman, Dale Bench, was fine. However, a slow-motion review of the footage reveals that the bike wheel actually did clip him on the back of his helmet, which is the reason his head snaps forward so violently. He just got up and walked away like a champ. Because they had no money, the production team had to resort to some serious theft. In the scene where the bikers are smashing up the town, many of the props and signs were actually stolen from real towns by the crew in the middle of the night because they couldn't afford to have the art department make them. And it wasn't just signs. The blue van that gets destroyed in the opening chase, that was George Miller's own car. He sacrificed his personal vehicle to get the shot because they had run out of cars to wreck. This beg, borrow, and steal mentality extended to the costumes too. If you look closely at the MFP police officers, only Mel Gibson is wearing real leather. The budget was so tight that all the other officers, including Goose, are wearing vinyl knockoffs. You can actually tell in some scenes because the vinyl doesn't crease or age the same way Mel's jacket does. One of the most iconic elements of the film is the villain, the toe cutter, played by Hugh Case Byrne.
The Knight Rider. That is his name.
His performance was so memorable that George Miller brought him back 36 years later to play the main villain, Immortan Joe, in Mad Max Fury Road. It's one of the coolest full-circle moments in cinema history. But not everyone loved the movie when it first came out. In fact, the film was banned in New Zealand. The censors were horrified by the scene where Goose is burned alive in his vehicle. Unfortunately, this scene mirrored a real-life gang incident that had happened in New Zealand shortly before the release, so they pulled the movie from theaters to prevent copycats. It wasn't unbanned until 1983, after the sequel had already come out. And if you grew up in the United States, you probably watched a completely different version of the movie than the rest of the world. The American distributors were convinced that US audiences wouldn't be able to understand the thick Australian accents and slang.
Now they're standing here with a gun. Down, everybody down, you down. Line! Aha! Go for glory, you know, like a try. And I'm trying to get them over there because I'm wondering if they might shoot. And I did my MMA around the head. Tackle! And that's it, hang on.
So, they hired American voice actors to dub over the entire movie. And let me tell you, it was terrible. They gave Max a generic American action hero voice that didn't match Mel Gibson's performance at all. It wasn't until the DVD release decades later that the original Australian audio track was widely available in the States. The iconic V8 Interceptor, the last of the V8s, is a character in itself. The car is a 1973 Ford XB Falcon GT hardtop, a model that was only sold in Australia. The production team modified it with that massive supercharger on the hood. But here's the kicker, the supercharger was fake. It was driven by an electric motor that they could turn on and off with a switch. There's a really funny Easter egg regarding the eyes scene. When the character Toe Cutter gets hit by the semi-truck at the end, his eyes famously bug out of his head. That wasn't a sophisticated prosthetic. The special effects team simply painted a pair of goggles to look like eyes and put them on a dummy. It looks ridiculous in HD, but back in 1979 drive-ins, it was terrifying. In my last video, I talked about Fight Club having hidden Starbucks cups. Well, Mad Max has a hidden nod to classic cinema. George Miller wanted Mad Max to be a silent movie with sound. He directed the film with the intention that you could watch it without any dialogue and still understand exactly what was happening, purely through the visuals. This is why there is so little dialogue for Max himself. Another weird fact is that the film is set a few years from now. The date on the clapboard in the opening scene reads December 6th, 1984. This means the societal collapse happened in the mid-80s. It's kind of funny to think that in the Mad Max timeline, the apocalypse was happening at the same time the Ghostbusters were saving New York. Despite being an action movie, Mad Max actually has a very low body count. If you don't count the off-screen deaths of Max's family, Max actually only kills a handful of people in the entire movie. It's only in the sequels that he turns into a one-man army. In this first film, he's just a cop trying to do his job until he breaks. Finally, the legacy of the film saved the production company. Kennedy Miller Productions, the company formed by George Miller and Byron Kennedy, was so broke by the end of filming that they couldn't afford to pay the crew. George Miller ended up giving points, a percentage of the profits, to the crew members instead of salary. Since the movie became the most profitable film of all time, those crew members who accepted the points likely made more money than they would have in a lifetime of working on other movies. So there you have it, 20 facts you probably didn't know about Mad Max. It's a film that proves you don't need hundreds of millions of dollars to make a classic. You just need a vision, a doctor's knowledge of trauma, and a complete disregard for safety regulations. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to leave me a like and subscribe for more content like this. All right, till next time, see you on the road.